The screen of Nancy Guthrie's phone didn't just light up, it pulsed in the dark. A frantic heartbeat of notifications that no one was awake to see, but it was the voicemail left at the edge of dawn that changed everything. A recording of nothing but heavy, rhythmic breathing and the distant, unmistakable metallic clinking of keys against a porch railing. When Nancy's sister finally listened to it, she didn't hear a prank or a wrong number. She heard the sound of someone standing exactly where they weren't supposed to be, waiting for a door to open that had been locked for decades. The air in that small town didn't just turn cold, it turned heavy, as if the soil itself was trying to hold its breath. Nancy Guthrie wasn't the kind of woman who vanished. She was the kind of woman who left the porch light on for neighbors and kept a physical calendar marked with birthdays in looped, careful cursive. But when the local sheriff found her kitchen table set for two plates of untouched cooling pot roast and 2 glasses of sweetened tea, the silence in the house felt like a physical weight. There was no struggle, no broken glass, just a single chair pulled out at an awkward angle, as if someone had stood up in a hurry, or perhaps been pulled upward by a force they couldn't fight. The most unsettling detail wasn't what was missing, but what had been added. Tucked neatly under Nancy's napkin was a weathered slip of paper with a list of 7 last names, written in a hand that was most definitely not hers. The names were local, familiar, and seemingly random, ranging from the town's founding family to the man who delivered the mail. As the investigators stood in that quiet kitchen, the realization began to sink in that Nancy hadn't been cooking for a friend. She had been preparing a final meal for a guest who brought a ledger of the doomed dot. By the 3rd day of the search, the atmosphere in the valley shifted from concern to a jagged, piercing paranoia. Nancy's disappearance wasn't being treated as a standard missing persons case anymore, because the FBI had arrived in black SUV, bypassing the local station entirely to cordon off a specific patch of woods behind the old Guthrie estate. They weren't looking for a body in the brush. They brought ground-penetrating radar and heavy machinery. They were looking for something deep, something the earth had swallowed years ago, and they seemed to know exactly where the coordinates ended. The townspeople watched from the yellow tape, whispering about the list found on the table. Those 7 names began to circulate like a virus. If your name was on that list, you weren't just a witness. You were suddenly a ghost in your own life. Families who had shared Sunday dinners for generations stopped making eye contact at the grocery store. It wasn't just that Nancy was gone. It was the terrifying feeling that she had been the only thing keeping a very old, very dark lid on the town's shared history. And now that lid had been kicked wide open, detectives began tracing Nancy's final movements, and they found a trail that defied logic. 2 hours before she vanished, Nancy was seen at the county records office. But she wasn't looking at property deeds or birth certificates. A clerk remembered her being frightened but focused, requesting access to the 1974 census, specifically the records that had been damaged in a localized fire decades ago. She was seen scribbling frantically, her hand shaking so violently she dropped her pen 3 times. She left without saying goodbye, clutching a folder to her chest like it was a shield. When the FBI finally seized those same records later that afternoon, they found that Nancy hadn't been looking for her own family. She had been cross-referencing the 7 names from the napkin with a list of unaccounted workers from the old silver mine that collapsed in the 70s. The chilling part was that the official records stated the mine collapse had claimed no lives, yet Nancy had written a single word in the margin of her notes: foundations. It wasn't a geological note. It was a map to where the Baftis and the secrets were literally buried under the town's very feet. The emotional center of the case cracked when Nancy's younger brother, Miller, broke his silence. He sat on his porch, staring at the FBI lights flickering in the distance, and told a reporter that Nancy had started hearing the humming weeks ago. She claimed it was coming from the floorboards of the pantry, a low-frequency vibration that made the silverware rattle. Everyone thought it was just the nerves of an aging woman living alone. But Miller looked at his hands and whispered that he started hearing it too only after he visited her for coffee. It wasn't a ghost story to them. It was a mechanical reality. Nancy had become convinced that the specific last names on that list weren't just random families, but the descendants of a group of men who had signed a blood silence pact 50 years ago. As Miller spoke, his voice trailed off because he realized his own last name was Guthrie, the name at the very top of the list. The fear in his eyes wasn't for Nancy anymore. It was the look of a man who realized that the disappearance wasn't a kidnapping, but a collection of a long overdue debt, the mystery deepened when a local hiker found Nancy's coat snagged on a briar patch 3 miles from her home, in the opposite direction of the FBI's primary dig site. Inside the pocket was a digital recorder, the kind Nancy used for her grocery lists. But when the technicians played it back, there were no reminders for milk or bread. Instead, there was a recording of a conversation between Nancy and an unidentified male voice. The man's voice was gravelly, sounding like it was being forced through a throat filled with silt. "You can't give them the names, Nancy," the voice pleaded, sounding more terrified than threatening. Nancy's response was a sharp, crystalline whisper. "The basement is screaming, Arthur. I can't live on top of them anymore." The recording ended with the sound of a heavy door creaking open and the sudden, jarring noise of a shovel hitting stone. The Arthur she was speaking to had died in 1998. The FBI confirmed the voice match through old police archives, leaving the investigators to stare at each other in a room that suddenly felt far too small. Scene 6 finds the town in a state of total lockdown, but not by the police by choice. People were bolting doors that hadn't seen a key in years. The FBI had expanded their dig to the basements of 3 of the families mentioned on the napkin. In the Miller household, agents removed a false wall behind the furnace and found a series of interconnected tunnels that predated the house itself. These weren't amateur burrows. They were professional, reinforced shafts that led straight toward the Guthrie property. In those tunnels, they found nests, small areas with blankets, discarded candy wrappers from the 90s, and hundreds of photographs of Nancy Guthrie. She had been watched not for days, but for her entire adult life. The people living in the specific last names houses hadn't just been neighbors, they had been the unwitting keepers of a subterranean network. The realization was sickening. The town wasn't built over a mine. The town was built to be a ventilation system for something living beneath it. And Nancy had finally found the intake valve. Tension peaked when the FBI's ground radar hit a massive anomaly directly beneath Nancy's garden. It wasn't a body. It was a metal vault, the size of a shipping container, welded shut from the outside. As the saws began to scream against the reinforced steel, a group of elderly residents, the patriarchs of the remaining names on the list, gathered at the edge of the property. They didn't protest. They just stood there in their Sunday best, weeping silently. One of them held a Bible, but he wasn't reading it. He was squeezing it until his knuckles turned white. The air around the dig site began to smell like ozone and old, stagnant water. Investigators wore hazmat suits, expecting the worst of human depravity. But the silence coming from inside the vault was louder than any scream. Nancy's sister stood by the police cruiser, clutching Nancy's cat, watching the sparks fly. She remembered Nancy saying the soil felt unsteady last spring, but she never imagined that the ground her sister loved so much was actually a hollow shell, a stage set over a dark, industrial theater. Then came the twist that turned the investigation on its head. As the vault was finally pried open, it was empty. No bodies, no Nancy, no evidence of a crime, but on the interior wall of the vault, painted in fresh, wet black ink, were the 7 names again only. This time, 6 of them had been neatly crossed out. The only name remaining was Guthrie. The FBI realized in that moment that the vault wasn't a tomb. It was a transition point. They found a secondary hatch in the floor of the vault that led even deeper into the original, unmapped veins of the silver mine. The forensic team discovered that the heavy breathing from the voicemail matched the acoustic resonance of the wind moving through those deep shafts. But the real shock was the DNA found on the interior handle of the vault. It didn't belong to a kidnapper or a long-dead miner. It was Nancy's. Her fingerprints were on the inside, but there were no signs of struggle, no claw marks, no desperate attempts to get out. The evidence suggested that Nancy Guthrie hadn't been forced into the darkness. She had been the one who locked the door from the inside to keep the world out. As the agents descended into the lower shafts, they found the true Guthrie legacy. Nancy hadn't disappeared. She had gone home. They found a living space, deep in the bedrock, lit by stolen electricity and decorated with furniture that had gone missing from the town over the last 40 years. It was a mirror image of her upstairs parlor, meticulously recreated in the dark, and there, sitting in a rocking chair, was the body of a man who had been missing since 1974, the foreman of the mine collapse, who was supposed to have died with his crew. The foreman wasn't a victim. He was Nancy's father. The specific last names were the families who had provided him with food, supplies, and silence for half a century in exchange for the location of a rich, hidden vein of silver that kept the town wealthy during the recession. Nancy had discovered the truth as a child and had spent her life as the bridge between the surface and the subterranean. The list on the napkin wasn't a hit list. It was a list of the providers who had stopped paying their taxes. To the man in the dark, the full truth was far more devastating than a simple kidnapping. Nancy had realized that her father was dying, and the humming she heard was the failing of the life support systems he had jury-rigged in the deep. She knew that once he passed, the secrets of the silver and the crimes of the town's founders would be exposed. On the night she vanished, she didn't just set the table for two. She fed her father his final meal, helped him into his chair in the deep, and then performed one final act of devotion. When they found Nancy, she was sitting at his feet, her hand in his. In a section of the mine that she had intentionally collapsed using old blasting caps, she had ensured that no one would ever be able to question him, and no one would ever be able to claim the silver that had corrupted her town. She didn't want to be rescued. She wanted to be the final entry in the ledger. The FBI recovered the bodies, but they could never recover the peace of the town. Every person with those specific last names now has to live with the knowledge that their comfort was bought with the air of a buried man. The most haunting part isn't the tragedy of the mine or the secret Nancy kept for 50 years. It's the fact that even now, when the wind blows through the valley just right, the residents of that town swear they can still hear a faint, rhythmic pulsing coming from beneath their floorboards. It's a reminder that some things don't stay buried, and some debts can never be fully paid, no matter how much dirt you pile on top of them. Sleep well, knowing that the ground beneath you is never as solid as it seems.